Have you ever wondered if that sexual fantasy you keep having is a little bit odd? Well, I'm Dr. Rena Malik, urologist and pelvic surgeon, and today we're going to talk all about sexual fantasy. What sort of fantasies are there, and how often are people having these types of fantasies? And are these normal or maybe a little bit abnormal? So it's important to determine what exactly sexual fantasy is. It's essentially any sort of mental imagery that you perceive as erotic. When you look at studies, almost everybody has sexual fantasies. But why do people fantasize? So in a survey of over 4,000 people, they found that the majority of people fantasize because they want to feel aroused. Others are because they're curious and want to experience different types of sensations. Maybe they want to escape from reality. They want to sort of fulfill some sort of socially taboo sexual desire. They may want to plan a future sexual encounter, or they may want to reduce anxiety around a sexual encounter. Sometimes it's because you're bored and you don't have anything else to do. Other times it's to make yourself feel more sexually confident, or even very infrequently, sometimes it's because you may not find your current partner attractive. But again, that's a real minority of people who use sexual fantasy for that purpose. Ultimately, sexual fantasies can be very helpful. They can help us sort of handle unmet needs that we have in real life. They can help us distract ourselves, or even mentally work through some scenarios before we actually have sex. And so most of the time, sexual fantasy is completely safe. It's your own thoughts and no one needs to know about them if you don't want to, or you can share them with your partner when and if you feel comfortable. And fantasies are completely safe. Sometimes we'll want to keep them to ourselves, sometimes we may want to share them with a partner, and sometimes we may actually want to try them out in real life. But ultimately, a sexual fantasy is just that, the thoughts that our brain comes up with to help us feel arousal most of the time. Now, what are some common fantasies? So oftentimes having sex in new locations can be a fantasy, like maybe on a beach or a mountaintop, as well as having some sort of BDSM or bondage, dominance, submission, or masochism. And sometimes even being in an open relationship can be a common fantasy. Now, there's also fantasies that may be called atypical, but we're going to get into that a little bit more. But generally speaking, it's because our brain wants things that we can't naturally have. And so oftentimes these fantasies are things that are taboo or maybe not appropriate for day-to-day activities, like voyeurism or watching people have sex, or exhibitionism, displaying your genitals in public, or having fetishes with uncommon sexual objects or body parts like feet or underarms or things of that nature. You can even have gender bending fantasies, meaning you may see yourself as a different gender than you are naturally, or sexually fluid fantasies where you may demonstrate traits that are not necessarily congruent with your day-to-day activities. And these, again, are normal fantasies that people can have and are not considered to be dangerous in any way. And I know some people start feeling really stressed about sexual fantasies, but the reality is fighting against these thoughts can actually be counterproductive. And generally speaking, allowing these thoughts and exploring them in your mind is not hurting anybody. So as long as you feel like you're getting some arousal or pleasure out of it, you may be curious about why you find this pleasurable or why you're having this fantasy, but ultimately it's just that, a fantasy. What about fantasies by gender? Do they differ? So do men and women have different sexual fantasies? So when you look at the totality of the data, you find that men tend to have more impersonal fantasies. They tend to more often include social groups, meaning having more than one person in the sexual encounter, and they tend to be more dominant. Whereas women, on the other hand, tend to have more romance involved in their fantasies and more often submissive. Now, you having dominance or submission in a fantasy doesn't necessarily mean that's what you want in real life. Again, it is just a fantasy. In your brain, you can control how submissive or how dominant you are, and you can stop it at any time. And so it makes it a safe place to then explore and be vulnerable in your mind rather than being in real life. So when people talk about having these fantasies of submission or dominance, sometimes they will say that there's, a large proportion of them that don't actually want these things in real life. Now, what about forced sexual activities in your fantasy? So this one comes up a lot because people are sort of like, why am I having this fantasy? Because I would never want it in real life. But again, it is just a fantasy, and the idea of having control of it in your mind, you can control what the person looks like, you can control what they're doing, because again, it's in your mind. it is actually a very safe space to have that sort of fantasy. And in fact, when you look at data of people who do have these types of fantasies, they tend to be more sexually experienced. They tend to have less guilt or sexual guilt and be more erotophilic. What that means is their fantasies tend to be more intense and arousing and maybe even more diverse than people who don't have these types of fantasies. Interestingly, a very large study with almost 18,000 people was done in 2007. So take it with a grain of salt. It's been many, many years since 2007. But in this study, they found some really interesting points that only 42% of people tend to fantasize about their current partner or their spouse, whereas 90% of people fantasize about cheating or having sex with a non-spouse or non-current partner. Again, this is fantasy. You are not actually cheating on your spouse by having a fantasy about someone else. So there's no reason to feel guilty about it. This is, as you can see, very, very common and something that many people do even if they don't admit it. So remember how I mentioned there are fantasies that are considered typical and atypical? Well, in 2005, there was a study done in Quebec trying to decide how atypical are these fantasies actually? Should we really be describing them as atypical or are they quite common? And so what they did was they recruited people in the province of Quebec. And they did so by using social media, by doing radio interviews, by actually giving presentations at a variety of locations like sports clubs and meeting places, as well as through word of mouth. And they tried to recruit all adult individuals. They recruited about 799 women and 717 men around the average age of 30, ranging from anywhere from 18 years of age to 77. Now, it skewed a little bit to more younger individuals, so it was only about 10% of the whole group was over 55. And they used a questionnaire that's validated to measure fantasy, but they added questions about a variety of things. And they also included paraphilias. Now, what are paraphilias? Paraphilias are essentially when you have sexual urges about objects, activities, or even situations that are intense, recurrent, and may be considered atypical. These can include things like exhibitionism, displaying your genitals for the public, voyeurism, watching individuals have intercourse or have sexual activities, frotteurism, rubbing one's genitals on another person or something, oftentimes without their consent, masochism, deriving pain from pleasure or humiliation, and sadism is actually deriving pleasure from your own pain or humiliation. And fetishism, so being turned on by things or body parts that are not necessarily considered sexual in nature. So in addition to including some of these paraphilias, they also looked at Google at the time, and they looked at the top 100 searches and keywords that were searched in relation to fantasy. And they also looked at pornography sites and looked at the most common themes in those pornography sites to include them in the questionnaire. So I thought this was really well done because it wasn't just using a validated questionnaire that was made many years ago. It was actually incorporating more contemporary sorts of fantasies. And as you can imagine, fantasies have changed over the period of many, many years. They then, for each of these items, they had to measure intensity from a scale of 0, meaning no desire at all for this, to 7 being a very strong or very intense desire for this. And then they looked at the types of fantasies people put down, and they scored them based on intensity, as well as the percentage of people who identified as having this fantasy. And they described ones that were typical as those that were shared by 84.1% of participants or more. The first most intensely commonly shared, the first was having romantic emotions during the relationship. Now, this was more commonly shared by women than men, but certainly shared very often or very typically by both genders. The second was receiving oral sex, and this was more common by the male gender. The third was actually being in an unusual place. So that could be anything. Use your imagination. Any unusual place, maybe an office place or a movie theater. It didn't always have to be public, but usually when they chose a public place, it was often in a semi-private location, not where anyone could see them. And this was not technically typical based on the percentage. It was about 81 and 83%, but it was the third most intensely sort of described sexual fantasy. Number 4 was the atmosphere around the fantasy and the location of the fantasy being really important to them. So that was sort of a recurring type of theme in that it would be a very romantic atmosphere or a certain type of atmosphere and a certain type of location. And again, this was more common in women, but seen in both genders. 5th was specifically fantasies involving a romantic location, sort of like a deserted island, which was very perceived as romantic. And again, this was more common in women. And then 6th was having sex with someone other than their current partner. And this was very common in men. In fact, almost 83% of men agreed with this fantasy or had this fantasy compared to about 63% of women. And then the other common one for men was having sexual intercourse with 2 women. And the rest of the fantasies, there was very few that were considered unusual, meaning less than 15.9% had them, or rare, meaning less than 2.3% of people just had them. So let's talk about some more common ones. Being sexually dominated, tied up, being spanked or whipped, or even being forced to have sex were relatively common. Being sexually dominated was seen in 65% of women and 53% of men. Being tied up was seen in 52% of men and 46% of women. Being tied up or spanked or whipped was about 36% of women and 29% of men. And here's the kicker, forced to have sex. Again, this one comes up a lot because people are like, what does this mean? But again, it's just a fantasy. And so being forced to have sex, in your mind, you have control over that. It is not that you actually want to be forced to have sex in real life. And so that was seen in about 29% of women and 30% of men. So not uncommon at all, 1 in 3 almost. Other things were sort of anal sex or having sex in an unusual place, as we mentioned, sort of like toilets or office spaces. So again, the majority of fantasies were actually pretty common or not unusual or rare. So in this study also, they allowed people to describe their favorite sexual fantasy. So while we have proportions of people telling us what fantasies they've had in the past, this is them describing their most favorite sexual fantasy. And this was about 372 people, and they looked at all the data that they got, meaning they wrote these things out, and they looked at themes that came up, combined similar fantasies, and until they reached a point of what's called saturation, meaning that when they started looking through more and more answers, they weren't getting the same responses. And what they found was that for women, they most often enjoyed having sex in an exotic or an unusual location. And this could be in private, or if it was in public, it was usually in a semi-private location. It often involved their spouse or current partner. It was often using some sort of submissive component, meaning the person who was having the fantasy was the submissive individual, or it sometimes involved a stranger. So in men, the most common sexual fantasy was voyeurism, so watching other people engage in sexual intercourse, or followed by fetishism with either non-sexual objects, like feet, for example, with certain types of clothing or materials, or having it with certain body parts. Followed by trialism, or a sexual act with 3 or more people. Sometimes that included their partner that they currently had, or sometimes it was with strangers. Followed by fantasies of oral sex, anal sex, or sex in an erotic or unusual place. Now, when we look at these studies of people who have sexual fantasies and reporting on surveys, we do have to take it with a grain of salt. Generally, people who participate with these types of surveys are probably more open sexually, or may have more experience sexually, or may actually just have more fantasies in general. And so we might be skewing the population. And again, while this was a relatively large study and quite well done, it's still a small percentage of the population. It's not always representative of the entire population. So for example, this study had 85% heterosexual individuals and more often had Caucasian individuals, which may not, again, be the same as someone who did a study in another part of the world with a different population altogether. Now, again, I think the big take home here is that fantasies are very, very common. Many fantasies are not unusual. So many people have a whole variety of fantasies that are not typically unusual. And again, fantasies are safe when they stay in your mind or you're doing them with a consenting partner. They only become a problem when they become intrusive or compulsive or obsessive, and they're sort of coming into your thoughts all the time, and they progress to leading to either distress by you or your partner, or they're causing you dysfunction in real life. So you may be so preoccupied with a certain fantasy that when you are in face of having regular sex, which is maybe not as novel or erotic as your fantasy, you may actually have difficulty having either an orgasm or getting an erection. So these are when it becomes an issue, and it's a great time to then talk to a sex therapist or somebody with expertise in sexual health who's a psychologist who can help you sort of think through these issues and figure out how you can stop ruminating about these fantasies. You could find a sex therapist at aasect.org. I'll put the link down below so you can look up for a therapist near you. Now, guys, if you are enjoying my content, please be sure to check out my podcast, the Rena Malik MD podcast. I would greatly appreciate it if you like it, that you would leave a rating or review for us on the podcast. And it's always so helpful if you share my content with others so that people can find this great educational content. And the biggest compliment that I get from you guys is when someone tells me that they learned about my content from another subscriber and found me and it's changed their life. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate you all so very much. And always remember to take care of yourself because you're worth it.